Good evening.
Good
Good
evening.
evening, Ken.
Hello.
Hopefully everything's going out live, going out correctly. It looks like I have audio, and it looks like everything is working on that end. But we're going to try a new setup tonight where the person speaking is going to be in the big screen. So if you're unfortunate enough to be watching us on a large screen HD TV, you're going to see way more than you bargained for. So and if you're in the chat room, let me know. And we'll go from there if there's anything wrong. And welcome everyone to episode 465 of Line Upon Line. How did the Christian world compromise with paganism? And this is part one. Dr. Ricks, if you'd start us out.
Today we're going to look at sort of groaners about how people think, somewhat. So Bob says to Bill, I heard you talking to yourself. Are you really talking to yourself? And he says, yes, I am. He said, well, why are you talking to yourself? He says, well, I need expert advice. Here's a real short one. How do you know that you're going bald? Well, here's how you know. It takes longer and longer to wash your face.
It just keeps going up.
Yeah, the face keeps growing there right up here, side of your head. Two men are in the hospital, and Bob says to the other one, I'm Napoleon. Bruce says, no, you're not. He says, yes, I am Napoleon. He says, well, how do you know you're Napoleon? God told me. Bruce says, no, I didn't. A man was visiting Vienna, not the one in Illinois, but the one in Austria. And he hears this beautiful volume, deep music from underground. He walks over to Beethoven's gravesite and he hears the music, and it's playing his Ninth Symphony. He can't believe, so he runs out and gets some witnesses. I want you to hear this. And they go over to Beethoven's gravesite, and he's playing the Seventh Symphony. So he says, let's get somebody who really knows music. See what's going on. They bring somebody in that really knows music. And he says, you know what's going on? They're playing. He says, now he's playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. He says, do you know what's really going on? Do you know? He says, no. Beethoven is decomposing.
Oh, man.
I wasn't ready for that one.
We might as well start off with a little fun attitude as we look into the question of the background to how so much pagan compromise got into the Western Christian world. And I actually, as we thought about it, it seemed to me that it's both a how and a why question. And the why, and we'll start off by asking the question, why does God hate paganism? Because if you really know the Bible, you have to conclude God hates paganism. And many people wonder, well, why does he hate paganism? It's just cute little traditions and trinkets. And, I think you can go all over the Middle East and you can dig up these little iron figures that look like Coke bottles of, I guess it's Aphrodite, and there are other names for it, but they're all over the Middle East. You can dig them up. Well, what's so bad about cute little trinkets like that? Well, God made it dramatically clear what he thought of paganism. Can we look at Deuteronomy 12:30, please, Ken?
All right, real quick, but do you have your phone near the, are you?
Well, it's fairly close by, but you got an echo, right?
Well, someone says we're getting some static, so I just thought we'd eliminate that as a possibility.
Well, it's unplugged. Okay.
It must not be you then. It's not you then.
Hey, honey, turn the volume down just a little bit on that speaker. You see it? The second knob. Let me ask you, how does this sound? Any better? Does that sound a little better?
The source is the same as it was before, so it shouldn't be anything different.
Sounds clear.
I'll switch to the
on my end. I mean, I don't hear any static.
Yeah, that's through Skype,
Okay.
and this is going out through open broadcast.
If I unplug the phone, it shouldn't be working. See, it's unplugged. I know sometimes the phone is on the desk here, but I unplugged it. Well, how's it sound to you, Ken? You hear any? I can turn the volume of the speaker down a little bit. Would that help?
No, that's not going to do anything. We're going to have to see. There's a little static, but it's not having an effect on hearing the message. All right, never mind then. Let's just keep rolling
Okay.
for now. I'll play with it on my end while you.
Okay. Well, Ken, can you read Deuteronomy 12:30, please?
Got it. Take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them, and that you do not inquire. What was that? That you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I will also do. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods.
I was reading a commentary. Two of them actually said this. People might debate this. They said God realized that paganism had a lot of cute, attractive customs that appeal to human nature. At our stage, we have a hard time seeing it. And it was like a trap or a snare that would grab you. And then all the bad stuff, like a bad side effect, would take over later. And that people might think they're smart enough to handle all the cute little stuff and not get the bad stuff. But the commentary said God knew better.
One of the things that I was thinking about for this message tonight was one thing came to my mind was that we're after the flood of Noah, when Moses is giving these, God's commandments and revealing it to his people. And you have to realize the passage of time was probably, we're talking about maybe 1,000 years from the flood of Noah, when Noah walked off the ark, till the time that God called Abraham, and of course, eventually got to the time of Moses. A lot can happen in 1,000 years. That's a huge part of time there that went by, and a lot of things could transpire in human history without God's intervention into the lives and families. The other thing is one of the interesting parts of that passage there. It says, for every abomination. And when you go back and look in the Bible and the things we know in Proverbs, it tells us these 6 things are an abomination, and the Lord 7 things are an abomination. But a couple of other things are listed here, like eating unclean animals. That was an abomination. Lying with mankind as with womankind. God even told the Israelites that you weren't even to take their gold and silver when he would drive those nations out. They weren't even to touch their gold and silver that was left behind. It was he didn't want them to bring anything into their house that was a part of their pagan worship that evolved over these thousands of 1,000 years or whatever, and even to the point that it would eventually nearly wiped them out. And I'll save that for a little bit later.
It's obvious that he.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I started thinking it's all sort of along the same lines, Stan, with Noah, the initial steps into paganism, when the first little steps are made into giving something credit other than God. I guess that's got to be extremely insulting when you consider the world being refreshed, and so clean and unclean, and every living person has a foundation from Noah, has a righteous foundation, at least, that passed down through him. Obviously, that it didn't take in every instance. There's stories right then and there that prove that, but every little step away from God has got to be just a slap in the face to him in those early generations, and it multiplies over time, like you say. But the way that it offends him, those initial steps must have been pretty hard to take.
Yeah, and like we said, is even the fun things that seem like fun are bad for you. People just don't realize it. And I was thinking about the fun. Now I realize this all will seem very minor to us now, but some of the fun things that we all probably remember would be things like, well, my fun things would be things like chocolate covered eggs and dying Easter eggs. That would be, or Halloween and all the bad stuff you can get away with at Halloween. And in the old days, actually now parents have to guard their kids at Halloween. They're in more danger. It's a whole new world than when I was a kid. But still, the point is, all those things seem so innocent and so much fun, but they actually are moving people away from the real God.
One of the interesting little posts that I saw this week was Satan convinced a third of the angels to walk out of heaven, and he did it a little bit at a time. And that's sort of what this same characteristic here of these minor things that most people that I've talked to personally about Christmas and Easter and Halloween, they say, well, we don't worship it that way, or we don't use it in that fashion. But it's like playing with electricity or fire. You eventually, it's eventually going to get like a snake, jump up and bite you. And because you're training your mind to do something other than what God originally planned for you. And I think it absolutely does that. I think it drives small wedges between you and God, eventually breaking away big chunks at some point in time.
While by stating that you shouldn't even keep the gold or silver or anything at all, he was just trying to stress how much he hated it.
Yeah.
And how much how just getting anywhere near it is destructive. And we live in a world today that is drowning in paganism. And it's just everywhere you look. You can't watch the Super Bowl without watching a halftime pagan show. I mean, it's just everything you see now is pagan. All the awards, just everything on TV just about has that air.
Well, if you can imagine watching that in comparison to going to, I'm going to just say this sort of tongue in cheek, going to a boring church service, where it's dry, and you compare that to the glitz and the glamour of, modern entertainment and all of it has to offer. The thing is when the choice comes at a moment when you should make the right choice, as a young, impressionable person, which choice would you expect him to make? At a moment when it's really serious and you have to make an educated choice about following God or following something evil, you've been brought up in this environment that's wants to pick the glitz and the glamour, and we know where that eventually leads, I guess.
And that same pull definitely existed in the ancient world. When you put on the one hand, you could go study with the Pharisees, or you could go party with Dionysus. That's going to be a hard, that's a pretty strong pull. It's not like it doesn't have anything to offer that, people want. Maybe it's not good for you. That doesn't mean you don't want it.
And according to some ancient history professors I've listened to, they claim that the pagan religions had no ethics. Now, some countries had ethics, but they were separate from the religion, and they all were pantheistic. That is, they believed in many gods, maybe a god of the sea, a god of fertility, a god of the sky, and I don't know, a god of war. And anyway, you'd have to, and some of that's in Greek mythology, but there were no ethics. Matter of fact, some of the gods were as ruthless as and mean and crazy as, and so that. Compare that to the God who says, "Thou shalt not." You can see it's a big difference, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It certainly appeals to the human appetite, and human lust. And I mean, when you compare what took place in the Roman Colosseum would be not much different than what people enjoy watching a Super Bowl game or something in today's world, where they see all of this entertainment, actors on the scene, men fighting out battles, and the only difference is that we know where the Roman Colosseums led to, and that was actual killing of Christians and other prisoners, and seeing live executions. And I guess over time that eventually would happen. Could that, I should ask the question, could that happen even here in the United States?
By the way, there was several pagans, I believe it was Central and Latin America, where they had what I would call some kind of weird soccer game with a weird ball. But the team, and they came from different tribal, whatever, the team that lost was sacrificed, I mean, literally killed to the pagan god. So when I say they were fighting for their life in the game,
yeah,
and winning was everything, that was literally true. And when you say things, people, oh, that can't be true. Yes, that was true in several pagan societies.
And even to the point of, the religious services, they had temple prostitutes, and even those things were appealing to, human desires and human appetite, and sort of based on those things. And all of that, if you combine all of that together and take it as a package, it was very inviting for a pagan, or for anyone for that matter, to be a part of that movement. And everyone was doing it, and it was okay.
And in paganism, I mean, there's a deity for pretty much any aspect of life that you want to consider. If you want to be more fertile or have a good harvest, or whatever it may be, there's something you can propitiate. And if it's as easy as going there and making an offering, if you believe that, oh, it's as simple as doing this, and then you go about your business with confidence, that that gives you something still.
And you know what? And the Catholics wonder why burying a statue in the front yard of their house upside down helps it sell better. But no, we don't do paganism. You've all heard that, right?
I have not heard that.
It's if you bury some statue of some saint upside down in your front yard, your house will sell fast.
The patron saint of equity, I believe.
There's a patron saint of travel too. Yeah. We did something when I was a little kid that I enjoyed, but I just was reading about paganism. It's the maypole. Now that pole was a phallic symbol and a lot of gory stuff behind it, but you run around the circle and you have these ribbons, and you dance and sing as you wrap stuff around the pole. And probably the way the pagans did, they probably drank wine and had some version of a rally song to whatever pagan gods. Often it was to the, almost all the gods were male, and they had the same female consort. But, Aphrodite's, a few other different names, but you'll see that. And that kind of thing is fun for people, dancing around and singing and whatever. Not that they don't do any dancing or singing in God's religion. I think David did. But I think the pagans probably did it probably more loosely dressed and a little more wild, and I don't know how to put it in the blunt terms. Yes.
Or like an Israelite.
Yeah. So, Ken, would you read verse 32, please?
Take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I also will do. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they have done to their gods. Did I already read this?
Yeah.
But verse 32.
How long? You guys just going to keep me going? 32. Whatever I command.
32.
Yeah, let me, right. Okay. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it or take away from it.
That's what I was going to say, but I didn't want to interrupt you. You sound so efficient in reading it. you people realize that Ken is our producer. While we're just sitting around talking, he has more things to worry about.
Yeah.
But the reason I wanted to add that in there, people will say, well, why don't we add a little bit of pagan fun here, a little bit of pagan custom there? Doesn't it sound innocent?
My first thought when I read that was, you think about Christmas and Easter and Halloween and the things that we do. And by the way, I did the maypole when I was a kid. I think I was in the second or third grade and then they eventually did away with it here in our school system.
Mhm.
But it was fun, it was colorful. It was outside. We were, sort of dancing and the parties around the holidays. Of course, I grew up in the Church of God, and I understood that we shouldn't keep these things. But why is there so much emphasis on these holidays, and there is no emphasis on God's holy days and His Sabbath day? It's beyond me. I want to tell you guys this story because it was sort of shocking to me this week. A guy that I've been working with for 12 or 13 years came in my office. We talk almost every day. It took him this long to ask me, why do you go to church on Saturday? And I was almost floored because I thought, it's taken him this long. He's never been curious about this before. I mean, or did it take him this long to get up the nerve? And of course, my instant response was, well, God said in the beginning at creation that we're to sanctify the Sabbath day because He rested on the Sabbath day, and according to the commandment, He said to remember the Sabbath day. That's what I thought, and I thought it was sort of odd. It's like almost out of nowhere the light came on and intrigued him to ask the question. I want to know why people don't ask the question more often, because we're so steeped in paganism and in these customs that we cannot see the forest for the trees, and it just baffles me. But that's my comment.
They don't want no fundamentalist Christian harshing their mellow. They don't want to don't want to mess with their pagan fun. We don't want to be raining on their.
Let's read 1 Corinthians 10:20, please, Ken.
All right. Rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? We are stronger than He. Or are we stronger than He?
So we have to presume God knows there's something detrimental to society in raw paganism. Now, I'm going to ask this discussion question, see if any thoughts on it. Fun things like magic charms, and there are a whole bunch of different ones for travel, all kinds of stuff. Candy eggs, Halloween candy. And actually, we now have in this block at least two kids, one across the street from me, Halloween trees. Not just Christmas trees, but Halloween trees. How do they lead people away from God? And one thought occurred to me. I actually hadn't, when I grew up, we didn't have Halloween trees, but they have them now. And people across the street, they're nice people. They got two nice little kids, and one next door has two nice little kids. And they put up this tree with these gruesome pumpkins with teeth and fangs and some other scary stuff on the tree. And there's one around the corner. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how can that be bad for their kids?
I think Halloween's a good illustration of that, because you have different kinds of Halloween, if you will. You have got the church parking lot, trunk or treat, little kid Halloween. You got office party Halloween. Then you've got mature adult, sexy Halloween party maybe at the club. You see a lot of advertisements, things for that sort of that. And then you've got, bona fide, out in the open evil Halloween, and people who are all about that. And I feel like driving around and the decorations and things that people put out have gotten far more gruesome over the years. I mean, I've seen bodies hanging from trees and, you know, some really heinous stuff going on in people's yards that you don't really want to look at. And there's a progression there, because it's a different version of the same thing. It's innocent. It's for kids. Oh, it's society. It's your office. It's everybody's doing it. We're just getting together to have a good time. Oh, you know, we're congregating, and then yikes. Then the really yikes stuff, where if you are a Christian, if you care at all about that, you definitely can't go the yikes way. You would never go straight there, but you're gonna set your kids on that path. You're gonna put them on step one, and hope they don't climb the entire ladder. I guess that's best case.
You're exactly right, and that's why God said, "Don't even take the gold and silver. Don't get anywhere near paganism, because it will lead to more paganism. It'll suck you into the worst forms of it. So don't play with it."
And I think, like you said, very well done, Michael, about the Halloween trees and the decorations get more gruesome. And I presume, now I haven't watched all these movies and TV shows, just commercials see for them. And many of the movies that even kids watch about Halloween are getting more gruesome too.
It is, I guess it's something in human nature. We have this urge to outdo our neighbors. And one person will do one thing gruesome and gory, and the next year the guy next door has to do something twice as bad. And we've just sort of stair-stepped up over the last 30 or 40 years to hideous things that I have seen. I pulled up in a flea market in Dallas one time. Judy and I were there. A guy pulled up in a hearse, black hearse. He literally had he had taken some sort of a mannequin or something head, and like a decapitated head, and had it over the roof of his car, on the roof of his car, and it was played bloody and everything. And I saw that thing, and it just so baffled me, and it so enraged me that something that evil could be out here for little children to see. And I guess to answer your question, Dr. Ricks, is as you make these stair steps to worse and worse extreme observances of these days, and it's all started out all in fun, it tends to lead us farther and farther away from God, is your point. But also, along the way, the things of God begin to be dropped off. They begin to be let go. And instead of hanging on to the wholesome things of God, you're clinging to these observances. And of course, God knew that in the long run, or knew that ahead of time.
It's Satan's version of driving up in a van and offering kids candy. I mean, it's just what these pagan days are. That's what all this paganism is. It's come in, it's just have a piece of, here, I got candy for you, and then you get in there and you're in trouble, and you just can't get out.
It's getting young people to not be afraid of the occult. And really,
yes,
you should be. I mean, there are some people, not where you live, but there are some people deep into the occult in dangerous ways.
Even in Moses' day, their God warned already during that time against wizards and necromancy and those type of, those type of things, and familiar spirits. He warned against them even during that time. And you can imagine those are still alive and well in our society even today.
One of the things that I want to mention is testing and progressive revelation. Now, I'm going to give you what I think most of the people, when they say progressive revelations, what they mean is anything that is new, they call it progress, is better than anything that's old. So we're pushing the frontiers of newness. It has to be better. The problem with that when it comes to truth about God is that anything new could obviously be wrong. But worst of all, nothing God has ever said or done is wrong. Now, I would argue that maybe our understanding, the ancient society and why God did it may be difficult for us to understand. See, I think the question is not, was God wrong? We don't understand it completely yet. That makes more sense. But God is never, ever wrong. There's a particular guy that stole some people out of our church. And it took me his book was so complex. I finally got to chapter 15, and the guy openly said the Bible was wrong. A particular, I think it was a writer, I won't mention, well, it was Ezra. He wrote, is it 4 books in the Bible? I double checked the number. I think it's 4 books in the Bible. He said Ezra was wrong. He meant well. I think, wait a minute. Anybody who has some new doctrines, his new stuff is on Passover and related matters. Anybody who tells you the Bible is wrong is dangerous. Just because his idea is new is wrong.
And there's always going to be a new idea out there. Believe me, I've heard them for the last 25 years. It's invariable that every year somebody will send me or write me or show up and try to tell me some new discovery that they've made. Not that we can't make discoveries that we maybe haven't understood before, but something that is so in the opposite, diametrically opposite to what we've taught and believed for 40 years in the Church of God, 50, 60 years in the Church of God, and then all of a sudden, and they will always show up only usually around Passover or something like that, and it'll be so far-fetched, something you've never heard before, and then if you don't agree or accept it, you never see them again. So to me, it's a sign that I made the right decision to reject that.
Yeah, being progressive. But let's read Deuteronomy 13, 1-3, the first half of it, because it's an interesting scripture when you read it.
If there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass. Okay.
Now, when you first read that part, stop it just at that point, wouldn't you think the next sentence or two would be, boy, this is a great new teacher, seer, prophetess, prophet, whatever. Boy, this guy's got a lot in the ball because what he said came true, or he did some great magic trick or called fire from heaven. There are counterfeit miracles. I mean, the Bible implies that. You would expect that. But obviously, you all, of course, read this article. Read what Moses actually said, because I think it's kind of shocking.
Comes to pass, of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul.
So if somebody comes along with something new and he makes a prediction and the prediction comes true, God is allowing you to be tested. That's the only thing you can say. And then he tells you, no, it's all right to be right about a prediction, but if he contradicts the Bible and says, oh, Moses was wrong, Ezra was wrong, Samuel, whatever writer in the Bible he's undermining, Peter and Paul, they were wrong, or I'm giving you a whole new slant on the Bible. If it doesn't fit the foundation, you have to reject it.
We have to be like the Bereans. That would be my advice, is be like the Bereans, search the scriptures and see if what they say is true. I read, I think it was Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown said something like, the modern Jews use this scripture here actually to reject the teachings of Jesus, because he came along with a new doctrine, a new prophecy, a new religion, they thought. The only difference is a false teacher, and I like your point, Dr. Rich, that you made about there will be those who will be able to call fire down from heaven. I mean, that kind of miracle performing that will deceive the whole world. It's going to deceive most of the people on the face of the earth if we believe the words of the book of Revelation. But they believe that this scripture applied to Jesus. But the only difference is a false teacher is leading you away from the teachings of God. And Jesus was actually embracing the laws of God and trying to make them more pure and more binding on Christians, that they observe and do exactly what God's word. He was more spiritual, and I think he used the term more perfect, a more perfect observance of the laws of God, and that was the difference.
One thing going along with what you just said, Stan, is that, of course, Christ quoted many Old Testament prophecies and fulfilled them and all the time. But he was talking about marriage. The Pharisees were trying to trick him. You'll see it in Mark, but it's also in some of the other Gospels as well. He said, well, Moses allowed us to have a divorce document. And Christ's answer is really interesting. He said, that's not really what God wanted. From the very beginning, he wanted marriage to last the entire lifetime. But he knew, because God is pragmatic, and that's the part that's hard to understand. There's a pragmatic aspect. He knew that they would just mistreat women if they weren't allowed to divorce. But that's not really, and then Christ goes, that's not really what God wanted. And we probably only hear a summation of what he said. I imagine when he finished, those Pharisees were like, wow, how are we going to, that was meant to be a trick question to trap them. There was no way they could, in other words, Christ went back to the original meaning of the Bible, going all the way back to Genesis. This is what God really wanted.
And I like it that he said it's because of the hardness of your heart. I can see him pointing his finger at all of them when he said it. He really threw the ball back into their court every time they tried to corner him on a question. He put it back in their face, and he did it by using God's word every time.
He supported the Old Testament, and so did Paul. And, well, did we mention the other day that over 40 quotes in the book of Romans are direct out of the Old Testament?
So many. When you have a well-referenced Bible, it's really amazing how much of it is, a direct quote or a paraphrase, or so much.
Now this will probably get me in trouble, but that argument could be made. A lot of Muslims will say that the latest revelation is Muhammad and the Quran, because the Quran goes back, I believe, the 7th century, where the New Testament and the Old Testament are much, much, much older. And the Quran does paraphrase and quote some of the New and Old Testament. So they say, well, therefore, the Quran is the best because it's the latest. Well, I think the Jews would have a good argument that that does not apply. Because the Quran, in some subtle ways, well, not so subtle ways, well, there are all kinds of things in there that don't fit what God would want. I could go off on things like one way to convert people is give them a choice. We're going to slice off your head or you convert. Or we can sell you to slavery or you convert. And anyway, you know things about the Quran. But I guess we should move forward. But progressives will say things like that. But we need to remember truth is truth. And anything that Moses said that was true, nothing new is going to make it less true.
One of the things that came to my mind was, someone will take what your statement and say, well, what about the sacrifices? That's always the one that comes up for me when people ask me about, well, how orthodox are you? A guy asked me one time, do you guys still sacrifice? And I said, of course not. It's, we understand that many of these things that happened in the days of Moses and the children in the wilderness had to do with the temple. It had to do with the priesthood. It had to do with sacrifices. And many of these things were pointing to the reality, who was Jesus Christ. And we understand fully that when Jesus came, he fulfilled that ultimate sacrifice, because he was, as John said, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So there was no other sacrifice that could stand in his stead from that day forward. And so sacrifices were no longer necessary because the reality was there instead of the foreshadow, which was the temple and all the accoutrements and the priesthood and the sacrifices as well. That portion of it, we understand, was a foreshadow of Jesus Christ who came. But the rest of it, God's law, God's holy days, the idea of being set apart as an individual, the Sabbath day, are all still intact.
And two things that the holy days were given the first year that Israel was with God. They didn't set up the Levitical tabernacle until the second year, and some of the priestly things when you compare the end of Exodus, the beginning of Leviticus. So the holy days were established before the sacrifices. And actually, just what you just said, Stan, the New Testament, all that's explained. The book of Hebrews and a few other places, the New Testament said Christ is the only sacrifice we need. So if they just knew their own book, they'd realize it would answer their own question.
Well, Paul
I believe
said,
I
Go
believe
ahead,
it plays
Michael.
into what you were talking about, the hardness, because of the hardness of your hearts. This was given for you, that after he brought them out and all that, and they rebelled right away. He said, fine, you want rigmarole, you want pomp and ceremony and a lot of gold and robes, and you need a whole lifestyle to go along with it, a replacement for maybe a lot of the pagan influence that you're used to in Egypt. You have that in the ceremonies of the priesthood and all that. You have a whole system of holidays, holy days, righteous ones, and observances, and fanciness, finery, and ceremony, and all that to look forward to and participate in, to have a national life built around.
Paul even made a similar statement that Jesus made. He said, speaking of the sacrifices, he said these were added, and all the oblations and everything, these were added because of transgressions. The same thing that Jesus said to the Pharisees. It was because of the hardness of your heart. It was because of the transgressions that God implemented this sacrificial system to temporarily cover your sins until the one came who would eventually cover the sins of all human beings.
And I think when we understand Galatians better, when Paul's talking about liberty in Christ, at least in part, he means you reach a new level of spiritual growth. Not that certain more rigorous training things are bad. It's just that you don't need the training things anymore. You can move at a higher level without all those. We're not saying everything done in the priesthood was bad. We're not saying anything like that. We're just saying, Paul, when you reach a certain level, you don't need that anymore.
And one of the reasons I make that comment too is because there is and I'll be careful what I say, but there is a tendency to try to move back into the temple in that lifestyle, in that form of living, in the ceremony, which was beneficial to those ancient Israelites. But we don't have to become an ancient Israelite to be a Christian. And I mean, that includes trying to reinvent the temple worship service in modern Christianity. And I think there's a tendency to try to cling to these beloved scriptures in the Old Testament that have to do with temple worship and even sacrifices, which evidently will come to fore in the future. They will try to reinstitute that, and will, I guess, at some point. But that part of that service is not necessary because of the work of Jesus Christ and what he did here.
Yeah, we don't want to get
Maybe one
too
of you will
Jewish.
know which one of the prophets it is. I believe he said, in the day that I brought you out of Egypt, I spoke not to you or rather vice versa. In the day I spoke not to you concerning offerings and sacrifices in the day that I brought you out of Egypt only, obey my commandments and I'll be your God. Words to that effect, and you'll be my people. And I don't recall where that is specifically, but I know that is in there.
Yep, and people Well, you just have to don't get too Jewish. Some things Paul and God put in there because they needed it, but ultimately it's like a training wheel. Training wheels are good for you, but eventually you can make that bike do things you could never do on a training wheel. But also, God will test people. For instance, God could test the world in the future. Maybe I'll call him a super pope, but whatever. Maybe or others could come along and they predict the next great crash, financial crash. This must be a man of God. Well, maybe, but if he then, the next thing out of his mouth, he contradicts the Bible, then you know God is testing you to see how much you're going to support what God says over what some charismatic man may say or woman may say.
We covered that pretty extensively in the podcast in the book of Daniel. You know, when we're talking and relating the story about, that's why it's so imperative that we watch and that we understand what Daniel and what the book of Revelation has to say about that individual and those that will be supporting him, because he is going to deceive and he's going to have the power of Satan. And so if we don't understand what to watch for or who to watch for, we can easily be carried away with his charisma and his, I mean, look what Hitler did. He swayed a whole nation and swept them away down a river of blood in World War II. And I use that example quite often because he was such a charismatic leader. But, we have people like Jim Jones that happened when I was in, high school that, carried all these people down to Guyana, I believe it was. And they drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, that's how radical a person can become. And if they would have been watching and observing these things we're talking about tonight, they may not have been swept away.
And he got to the point, I believe, where he spurned the Bible and said he could throw it down and, do something vile to it. And people, were so enamored with him at that point in time that they just went along with it. And that's really the key to this, is if you're worshiping God, you're not going to be taken on those first steps away from the truth, right? And it can happen the other direction. I would like to interject that at this point. It can happen in the other direction, the Pharisaical way, where you begin worshiping your own righteousness and you're being so careful and you're so good all the time that becomes the truth. Like that's the center of your life now, and you're not gonna. That's not going to do it either. That can put you off the tracks in a different direction. Obviously, I mean, Scripture has examples. Also,
if you think, well, I'm so well educated, you realize that in the 1930s, Germany was the most educated country in the world. Some of the best philosophers, I say best from the world's perspective, not reality, are German philosophers. I got to rattle off a whole bunch, but you probably know what I mean. And yet Hitler, because he did get some easy, quick victories for them, just remember, education, especially in this world, is undermined by all kinds of principles of education that really are humanism. They rely on people know better than God. I mean, that's more or less what it boils down to. And obviously that's just not true.
And look what it's done to our society here and even in America. I mean, we're already going full bore down the road to saving the planet. The idea of God is in control, and he is the one that is the designer, the sustainer, the maker, he makes the sun come up every day and he moves the stars around as he wishes. And he feeds the vast oceans of life and the land animals and the plants. And to think that he needs human beings to somehow intervene on his behalf but the erudition in what you hear these people say, and they believe it. I had a gentleman I worked with. He firmly believes, 100% convinced, that human beings are the cause of all the downfall of the earth, and that the earth is slowly going to get colder or going to get warmer or something. Some catastrophe is going to happen because of what we're doing to the earth.
Tell you what, how did Israel fail a crucial test? And God will test you. That's one thing that we can see in the Bible. Abraham passed a great test. Let's go to 1 Kings 12:27 and see how the first king of the northern 10, Israel, failed a crucial test.
If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah.
So now the obvious thing is Jeroboam should have had, because a prophet of God told him, God has given you these 10 tribes. He should have had faith that if God's going to give you the 10 tribes, don't pull some power political maneuver to stay in power and undermine God's pure religion. But obviously that's what he did. Let's read verse 28, please, Ken.
Therefore the king made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt.
Two things. Obviously, he's saying it was the God of Israel. I mean, the God of Israel that brought them out of Egypt. But he's putting pagan symbols to represent that true God. And some commentators argue that he understood that the true God was invisible when he was riding on the bull. I don't know if I believe that, but it's irrelevant. He didn't want them to go up to Jerusalem because, well, they might eventually want to reunite the country and get rid of me. Here's something I have noticed. If someone comes to you and says, well, we don't want to go up to the feast, and it could also be another feast like Pentecost, but we don't want to go to the Feast of Tabernacles. It's too far. Why don't we have a feast in our local church? In my experience being a church, often that turns out to be a trap. People end up falling out of God's church. And I'm not saying that you can't do that, at home because you can't afford to go or you're too unhealthy to travel. I understand that. But apart from circumstances like that, a feast kept at home with 2 or 3 local people is just not the same ball game.
Yeah. I would like to remind everybody of what happened to the Israelites. I jokingly said something about the Israelites a while ago. When Moses was on the mountain and the people demanded, that they be led back to Egypt, and Aaron took all their golden earrings and all their vessels, whatever he did, is, melted it down and made the golden calves. He said almost the identical same thing that Jeroboam did. Here's your God, O Israel. And if you'll remember, right after that, Aaron said, tomorrow is a feast unto the Lord. And they actually created a feast day. And of course, we know what happened. It became a scene that I love in the movie, The 10 Commandments, because they made it. I thought they did a really good job of the decadence and the, dancing and the celebration and complete defiance of God. But, Jeroboam, in my opinion, I think I like the term you used, Dr. Ricks, that he politicized the thing. It's interesting that that's what's in our society today, that when something gets politicized, the people jump on their sides of their party, whether it's right or wrong. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. They're going to jump on the side of the party. Jeroboam knew exactly what he was doing, or he wouldn't have asked his advisors, what should I do? He knew exactly what he was doing. And, he essentially wanted to remain in power. He wanted them to worship and keep their allegiance with him and not to return. The idea that he would even say they will go down to Jerusalem and worship the true God is beyond me. It's hard for me to believe that someone would even say that, because they're saying worship me instead of worship God. It seems to indicate that.
90% of the politicians in D.C. would do the exact same thing today.
Yeah, and he gave them 2 convenient locations. So before they even got to Jerusalem, they got to one of them, or if they're up north. Yeah, the convenience, God doesn't make everything super convenient.
You
Some
know,
things he wants you to make an effort to do.
You know, real quick, did we already experience the thing with the problem with the feast? A couple of years of COVID has thinned the feast out quite dramatically in all locations, and we haven't seen them people since. And you know, there's just the excuse of possible getting ill stopped them from coming, and they have 3 years running they didn't go.
Yeah.
And the church history proves that people who consistently don't come to the feast don't grow spiritually. I'm not oversimplifying it. Always each issue's unique, but you know what I mean.
I think there's an interesting opposite example in Lake Tahoe that I saw, because they had a good crowd as much as usual, or maybe even more, 60, 70, almost 70 at the peak in one day. 2020, California is locked down tight. They weren't allowed to have the feast. You're deprived of some of that, and maybe you want it more the next year going back into it. And so maybe that same hesitant thing. It's not that fear didn't keep you home, it was you were not allowed to meet there. Convention center says no.
Good. Ken, would you read the next verse? I think it's 12:30, I believe.
And this thing became a sin for the people, and he made a house of high places and made priests of the lowest of the people who were not the sons of Levi.
Now, the importance of that, because some are offended by the term lowest of the people, but one way to view it is the Levites were supposed to know the Bible, and they were trained by their parents and other higher priests, and they knew all those things, that are in what we call the Torah, the core of the Bible, because you didn't have books. I mean, there were some scrolls, but they weren't all that many. So if you got rid of the people who knew the Bible, in effect, you got rid of the Bible. So he could push any false doctrine. He could trample the truth of God. And the priests he hired, they'd do anything for the money.
I mentioned earlier, Aaron's actions almost got the whole nation of Israel killed, because God said to Moses when he came down, away with, stand back. I'm going to destroy this whole nation, and I'm going to start over with you. Aaron should have stood up against it, as did the Levites during this time that we're reading about here in Jeroboam's day. Jeroboam, I think Jeroboam had a guilty conscience too, because you remember he made the statement, if they go back down to Jerusalem and the people return to the true God, they're going to turn around and kill me. That tells me they're going to realize what kind of scoundrel I really am, and they're going to kill me. And so I think he knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that it was wrong. And he knew he had to make maneuvers to keep himself in power, because it would have cost him his life.
And if he had trusted God and tried to be faithful. But a lot of people put politics ahead of what I call pure worship of the true God. And that's, like you say, he was kind of a scoundrel in that way. By the way, commentaries say he did talk to his advisors, but they were just as carnal as he was. Probably few of them tried to talk him out of it.
If he goes down, they go down. So they're all in on it. They're going to be, oh, this is great. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me. Just keep all the all the good food and all the stuff coming, and we'll go along with that. Just don't let me lose my gig.
Yep.
Jeroboam's success in itself, or his taking of the northern 10 tribes, is itself a correction because of what the whole nation had fallen into under Solomon, though. That a lot of paganism had already been tolerated. Solomon had already set up a lot of altars for the gods of his different wives. That was right there. That was in Jerusalem. That was in the center. And I feel like that plays into what we were talking about earlier about compromising. Now, if they had been very severe in keeping all that away and at arm's length, would the people, even of the northern tribes, been ready to go along with Jeroboam in this, to accept his leadership? I mean, Solomon taxed them heavily, and I'm sure they had other grievances and things like that. You know, he wasn't shy of wrangling up whoever he wanted to do work, whatever work he wanted them to do, right? There's plenty of examples of that as well. But if they had been resisting this influence the entire time, would they have said, sure, you know, we'll just go to the calves instead? What's the difference? How different is that from what you're going to see right across from the temple of God in Jerusalem?
Yeah, notice they didn't ride him out on a rail.
Mm-hmm.
The people went along with it.
Yeah, they failed the test too. Though the way the Bible is worded, Jeroboam takes the lion's share of the blame, and his dynasty was ended violently because of what he did. Well, of course, anyway, let's go to verse 32, because Jeroboam in the Old Testament gets a real roasting from God.
And Jeroboam ordered a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made.
So he made himself high priest, and he changed. Think about the arrogance of changing God's holy days. Now, only one is mentioned, but I'll bet he also did the Passover and unleavened bread too, because often they go up to Jerusalem for that. I bet he changed that as well.
The holy days are at logical times to make offerings for any kind of agrarian society. That is why they are when they are. That's the time that you would have anything to offer and to celebrate. And, you know, you've just brought it all in these three seasons of the year, as it's phrased. You know, it's logical.
One of the commentaries stated that they believe that maybe the growing season was a little bit later in the northern tribes, and that's why he picked the 8th month. But they also came back and said, but truly it was because he wanted to obliterate any association between Jerusalem and Bethel. Bethel was only, just a few miles, maybe 20 miles from Jerusalem. I mean, they could almost see Jerusalem from where they were, but to save a little expense, save a little trouble of traveling, and evidently that one in Bethel became one of the most popular ones that they didn't have to go back to. The other thing was that the calves may have looked something like a cherubim, or in form or shape, which would have been maybe biblical. But the objection that the commentary took to that was that he made symbols and he changed the symbols. He made symbols and images, which God condemned. God said, don't ever make anything in heaven above, earth beneath, and water under the earth, any likeness of anything. But he also changed the places and the times. And that was, we know was contrary to God's law of changing, making changes.
Nobody should mess with God's holy day. Maybe understanding everything is a struggle, but altering something for political power, financial reasons is wrong. And Jeroboam is greatly condemned for that. By the way, you all probably know that because he changed the religion, the pathway for repentance is obscured. And the northern 10 never had a good king, and they never had a revival, where Judah had a number of revivals, and the kings of Judah, for the most part, they lasted much longer. The kings of northern 10 often were assassinated by their top general. It was like a merry-go-round. It was just, compared to Judah, Jeroboam got them off to a bad start, and it never really helped.
You would have thought Jeroboam, when he, another commentary that I read was that Jeroboam looked to Egypt when he saw that the pharaohs had combined the power of being king and the high priest, which, by the way, doesn't that sound familiar to in the time of the end, when those two will again be combined? But he saw that that combined effort could be contained within one person, and he would have total sway over that nation. And it was below him to have anyone else be the high priest. I thought that was really, really interesting that he would look at that and see that example in Egypt instead of following the true God.
That's true. In religious matters, the high priest in Jerusalem would have outranked him, at least in religious matters. I can see where, it's another reason. I hadn't thought of it that way. Let's look at 2 Kings 17:7. This is an overview of what, and there are many scriptures like this, I only just quoted a few, of what God thought about Jeroboam's influence on the northern 10.
And it happened because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, and had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord cast out, and of the kings of Israel which the nations had made. And sons of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God, and they built high places.
And I like the word secretly. That means they schemed. They didn't tell. My bet is they probably didn't tell the people the reason they were building these golden calves in strategic positions. They didn't say, we don't want you to go back to Jerusalem because you might want to reunite the nation and get rid of our royal house. I'm sure they didn't tell the people that. They gave them the excuse, it's just too far to travel.
And at some point along the way, there were Levites that lived in those northern tribes because they were scattered throughout all the tribes of Israel. The Levites had an opportunity at some point to say something and to do something. And one of the points that was made was that they did nothing. And by doing nothing, they allowed this to happen, and they may have had some responsibility in that, although the Bible lays the blame at Jeroboam's door.
Let's go to 14:16. But that, no doubt, a lot of people probably were silent who were suspicious of what he was doing, but they didn't do anything, apparently, or not enough.
And he shall give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, who did sin and who made Israel to sin, because of the sins of Jeroboam which he sinned, and which he made Israel sin by his provocation, wherewith he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger.
And they went into captivity much sooner than Judah because of the sins of Jeroboam. And he's the clear villain in that regard. Counterfeit religion also is a gateway to pure paganism. Let's go to the next verse and look at how I think his counterfeit religion was a gateway to pure pagan religion.
And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the sons of Nebat. And he took to wife Jezebel, and went and served Baal.
And I know this topic is not about marriage and all that, but I would say this much: be careful who you marry. If you marry somebody that you know is a witch and is into the occult, aren't you asking for trouble?
Well, it's an interesting quirk in human nature too, that when somebody does something and they seemingly get away with it, that the next person or the next generation thinks, well, maybe we could go a little farther and it would be okay. And what happened to his lineage, and the kings that followed him, they became worse and worse because each generation never stood up against what was happening to their country. And I see that. I guess I see that in some part in our own country today.
Yep.
And be careful who you marry.
You bet.
And some of us got lucky, right, Ken? And we made good choices, right?
Absolutely.
I think all
And Michael and Stan too. I don't want to get in trouble here. Michael and Stan too.
yeah, don't exclude me in that list. I think we all did really well.
Yes.
And we want to show God our love and commitment to Him, and avoid the counterfeits. And this is my last scripture, but I want to show you that the same thing that happened to the northern 10 tribes of Israel also happened to the true church of God. This is the last, well, except for the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, written near the end of that first century called the Apostolic Century. And just notice what Jude has to say. Could you read that part, Ken, please?
All haste to write to you about the common salvation, beloved. I had need to write to you to exhort you to contend earnestly for the faith once delivered. For certain men crept in secretly, ungodly ones, preventing the grace of our God for unbridled lust and denying the only Master God, even our Lord Jesus Christ.
And notice they came in secretly. Paul mentions that in some of his letters too. In other words, they didn't tell the people. They came to, it's obviously they're at the same feast with them. They came in secretly to pervert grace. Isn't that what you hear all the time? We live in grace, not law. Grace and law actually go together, because if there is no law, you don't need grace. But I understand how they mean it. That perversion was starting to take over even that far back secretly. It was a compromise. And we have to be careful with compromising anything God says. And by the way, paganism was not just bad just because of children were sacrificed in the fire. They also sacrificed adults. And in some pagans, they made gruesome sacrifices because they, in fear of some of these weird gods, they thought they got more bang for the buck by weird, gruesome sacrifice. Things that I don't even want to mention. They're so grisly. And they also, if you wanted to be a priest of, at least in some cultures, and Aphrodite's, they had this machine looked like a nutcracker, and it would castrate men and all this gruesome stuff. And I could go other bad things that happened.
And it looked like a nutcracker.
Yeah, it looked like a giant nutcracker. And
be careful.
You've seen some of those pagans. They have copies of it in the British Museum. You can see
Sounds
it.
like
if
it
you
more
want
than
to.
looked like one.
It is one, yeah. They got them that they dug them up in Europe, and there are all kinds of grisly things that are in paganism. One final thing: did you know that a lot of the temple prostitutes, both male and female, did not volunteer? Their parents, the pagan temple bought them from their parents, or their parents gifted them at age like 9, 10, and 11, and they would serve their youth as sexual slaves to the temple until they were just burned out physically. Now think about doing that to people.
It seems that the world is going back to that kind of trash. They're trying to normalize it again today.
Paganism is coming back. And even innocent things like Harry Potter's book. I realize it's an innocent little children's book, but isn't it getting children excited about the occult?
Another gateway.
Well, it certainly is in our society, and it's in our movies, and it's our books, and as I said earlier, it makes it a lot more fun. It makes it a lot more exciting. It makes it a lot more exhilarating and fantastic than going to church. And I guess we, as Church of God, have to sort of combat that, with, keeping in mind the precious mind of a child, and keeping our church services, exciting and exhilarating to a young person, making it interesting for them, activities for them to do, and things for them to, to learn about God, and and including them in a part of our worship service instead of just, having being so directed only at adults, which I understand that is a big part of what we do. But how are we going to cultivate the next generation if we don't focus on our children as well? And I think it's, and parents have that same responsibility as well.
That's a good point, because really the baptized member who knows the truth and has been living the truth is relatively safe compared to the child who still has, all of growing up and the world to face and figure out on their own still. That's an important thing to keep in mind, definitely.
Well, Jesus said, "Go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel unto every creature." Not go ye therefore into the world and preach to the church all the time. We have a responsibility to the world, and I know it's difficult, and I know it's you're banging up against I call it the black blanket that covers the minds and hearts of people, but we still have a responsibility to do it, and I'm still excited about doing it.
And it's tough. It's a tough battle out there. One final comment. That movie Avatar, the movie was visually exciting, and so it was a visual thing. But I remember thinking to myself, if this isn't promoting earth worship, I can't think of what else is promoting. If not, it's earth worship, pure and simple.
Yeah, I didn't see it.
Even the cartoons today, we have to be very selective with our grandkids, because I've sat and watched modern cartoons, and they're unlike the ones we had when we were a child, but there is a lot of inclusion and a lot of things having to do with the earth and pollution and recycling and those types of things that are actually political things now, and sexuality as well. I think there are hints of sexuality even in cartoons that my little 2 and 5-year-old grandson would watch, and I have to be, we have to be careful, and thankfully their mother is.
That started way back in the 90s with Captain Planet.
He's a hero.
And I refuse to let it be watched in my house with my children.
Good. I saw one of those with our kids. All I remember is the villain wanted to poison the planet. I said to my kids, wait a minute, what kind of sense does that make? Say if you're the villain and your goal is to plan, well, where are you going to live? I mean, it didn't even make logical sense. But, of course, it was for kids, and they would not think as logically as we would. But it was totally illogical, but they bought it. And that was like taken for granted.
And we're dealing with the generation that grew up on all that trash now that think we're all poisoning the planet, when most all of the polluting is done by Asia and parts of Europe. We're not doing any of it. Our air is getting cleaner, and China's and Indonesia's and India's is getting way worse. In fact, that big floating barge of plastic is like 98% from one river in Asia. It's all, but they won't talk about that river. They just want to say it's all our fault because some turtle got a plastic straw up his nose 10 years ago.
We're the ones they want to overregulate. But I know we're out of time, but I want to thank all of you for your participation. Part 2, remember, this was kind of the background from the Old Testament. But part 2, we're going to kind of move the story forward, and you'll see compromise with the truth is, well, it's all around us.
Yep. All right. Well, that's good. I want to thank everyone for watching and checking out the new setup tonight. Everybody seemed to like it, so we'll probably stick with this for a while. And I want to thank everyone for showing up, and tell everyone to have a great rest of your Sabbath, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good
Happy
night.
Sabbath.
We're happy you could make it.
so glad you are here and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.